I'm András Papp, and I'm talking about debt swapping for risk mitigation in financial networks, presenting a joint work with Roger Wattenhofer. So nowadays, the world's financial system is a complex interconnected network of banks and financial institutions, which are connected by different kinds of debt contracts, which means that if one of the banks goes into default and cannot pay its obligations, then other banks don't get their money. So they might also go into default and so on. We might witness this cascading effect throughout the whole network. So because of this, the network-based study of these financial systems has been rapidly gaining attention in the last decade or so. And actually, the base model to study these financial networks is quite simple. We have banks, or nodes in a more graph theoretical perspective. And each of these banks has a certain amount of funds shown in these little rectangles besides the nodes. And between these banks, we have debt contracts saying that, for example, Bank U has to pay 1 unit of money to Bank V. And we're already going to simplify the notation a bit here, since most of our examples will have debts of weight 1. From now on, we only show the weight of these debt contracts when it's something different from 1. So based on these banks and debt contracts, we can already define the assets and liabilities of each bank in these networks. For example, Bank U has 3 units of money itself and receives 1 unit of money from the source node, so it will have total assets of 4. On the other hand, it only has a liability of 1, so it can easily fulfill this payment obligation, and 3 units of money remain at U. On the other hand, if you look at this Bank V, it has 1 unit of money itself and receives 1 unit of incoming payment, which means total assets of 2. And on the other hand, it has total liabilities of 4. So this is the case when we say that Bank V is in default because it cannot fulfill its payment obligations. And in this case, the models of financial networks usually assume that V has to use all of its money to pay at least some amount of its debts. And it has to make these payments proportionally to the outgoing contracts. So in this case, 1 unit of payment on both outgoing debts. So this model of financial networks is quite popular because it's simple, but it can already model these ripple effects that propagate through the network, which are often connected to financial shocks. And on the other hand, it's also nice in the sense that apart from some edge cases, there's almost always only one solution in the system. And moreover, by solution, we mean this payment configuration, which satisfies these rules that we've outlined before. And moreover, this solution can be found in polynomial time. So the whole system is quite nice or simple from a computational perspective. And what we're going to look at in this talk is the operation of debt swapping in these financial networks. So if we have this example network, then banks U and V might decide to exchange, swap these incoming debt contracts with each other, creating this new topology where the debts are directed towards the other node. And this is also not so unrealistic in practice because they essentially own these contracts as creditors. So this might easily be possible in many legal frameworks. So if we look at this example, there's quite some motivation for the banks to do this. So for example, this Bank U is in quite a vulnerable situation because if this source node is hit by some shock or event or some reason it loses its funds, then you will receive no payment from this network at all. And similarly, V is also in a volatile situation because if this source node is hit by a shock, then V receives no payment at all. On the other hand, if we look at the topology after swapping, then we see that whichever bank is hit by a shock, that is, whichever bank loses its funds due to some unforeseen event, both U and V will receive at least a payment of 1 in this network. So this is what we call a positive swap. And this is what we're going to be looking for throughout this talk. When doing this operation is both beneficial for U and V according to some objective function. And in particular, we're going to look at 4 different objectives or 4 different scenarios. The simplest one is when there's no shock in the network at all. So nodes only want to maximize the assets they get from the network. So from this perspective, our previous example was quite simple. Both U and V received a payment of 2 in the original network. And after swapping, they still receive a payment of 2. So this is not a beneficial step if we try to optimize for simply assets. And apart from that, we're going to look at resilience to three different simple kinds of shocks that can hit the network. First of them is a proportional shock, when all banks in the network lose the same lambda portion of their funds at the same time. And in this case, for example, in our previous case, if lambda equals 0, so there's no shock, then both U and V start with a payment of 2. When lambda is 1/2, then the source nodes can still barely, but still pay their obligations. So both U and V will still have assets of 2. And from this point, they start losing money until lambda becomes 1, when they have no payment at all. And actually, we have the same situation after swapping again. So in the beginning, they have assets of 2. Up to lambda equals 1/2, they still get all their payment. And when lambda drops to 0, then this payment slowly fades away. When lambda goes to 1, this payment slowly fades away to 0. So this is also a case where it's not very beneficial to do this swap. Then there's the Vert shock model, when we assume that K banks in the system are hit by the shock, and these banks lose all their funds. And these are distributed across the network in the worst possible way for a given bank. This is the situation we looked at before. So in the original case, K equals 0 means no shock again. If one bank is hit by a shock, that means that both U and V lose all of their assets in the worst case. So they have a payment of 0. But the situation is now different after swapping, because once again, they start with a payment of 2. But now if only one bank is hit by a shock, they still receive a payment of 1, and it receives a shock of size K equals 2 until they lose all of their assets. So in this case, we see that the swapping operation is indeed a strictly proven. They get a better, safer situation for the case when one bank is hit by a shock. And finally, our last shock model is called Vert sum shock model, when we also assume the worst case, but now we assume that some amount rho of funds is lost from the system, so from some banks in the worst possible way. So once again, they'll start with a payment of 2. When there are only 2 funds lost from the system, then still everybody can fulfill their payment obligations, so there's no effect. But from this point until rho equals 4, the payment is linearly lost for you. On the other hand, if we look at the topology after swapping, still no effect until rho equals 2. From this point until rho equals 4, one of the source banks loses their funds. So the amount of assets U or V gets drops to 1 now. From this point up to 6, once again, no effect because the other source bank can still pay its obligations. And it takes a shock of size rho equals 8 until the banks get no So in this case, we again see that this is a strictly better situation for shocks of size between 2 and 8. So what we see is that in the first 2 cases, our example swap was not beneficial, not positive, but in the second 2 cases it was. And this is also a bit of a roadmap for the rest of the talk, because it turns out that in the first 2 cases, you cannot even have a positive swap in any kind of network. So first we're going to briefly discuss that. And then in the second 2 cases, we've seen that a positive swap is possible, which raises a lot of other interesting questions. So then we're also going to look at those. So starting with this no shock situation, let's look at a few examples to get an idea of what's happening here. For example, if we look at this network, both U and V receive some payment from their creditor, and U has to relay this payment to V. So in this network, if U and V decides to swap these vertical contracts, then we get a new network where U now has more money that's being relayed to V. And essentially, we see that the situation of V is the same. It has the same amount of money, whereas the situation for U has improved. So such a semi-positive swap is indeed possible, where it's better for one bank as it's same for another bank, even in a simple situation with a DAG. But this is not really the case we're interested in, right? We're interested in positive swaps when the situation is strictly better for both of the banks. And it's actually much harder to argue about these because the network topology can also have cycles. So a cyclic network topology is much more complicated because cycles can make the solution completely different in the system. Because the depth swapping might create new cycles or break up old ones. For example, in this case, we see this cycle where this 1 unit of money is going around. The payments are just being filled by relaying this 1 unit of money. And after swapping, we get a completely different situation where there's this half unit of money is just going through essentially a path in the network, and it increased to 0.75 a bit. So if we look at this the system, there's no clear invariance here. The amount of assets for U and V, there's some changes. The amount of payments on the edges also changes. So it's a much more complex situation if you have cycles in the network. And actually, one can show that it's still not possible to have a positive swap, even with any kind of cycles in the system. The proof for this is a bit more technical, so we're not going to go into details with that. But essentially, one can analyze different cases here based on how the payment changes on the swap contracts. And one can show that essentially we can construct an even larger solution in the original system, which is a contradiction. So in this no-shock situation, you cannot have positive swaps in any network. And the situation is somewhat similar in case of proportional shocks. First of all, here one can note that we cannot have a situation where both U and V end up in a better state for a specific shock size lambda, because then we could just take this lambda portion of funds away, and we would have a positive swap in a no-shock case before, which we've seen is not possible. And the more subtle case here is when a swap is positive because it's better for U for some shock size lambda 1 and better for V so for some other shock size lambda 2. And then similarly to the previous proof, one can actually show here that, that we can construct then a larger solution for the bigger one of these shock sizes, which is again a contradiction. So there is no proportional swap in any of these first two models. So let's focus on these worst case models instead, where we've seen that a positive swap is indeed possible. And in particular, we'll look at the Vert set model. So if you recall here, K banks are hit by a shock in the worst possible way for a specific node. And actually the worst sum model is usually very similar to this, just with extra technical steps. So that's why we focus on this simpler model now. So we've seen that a swap can be positive for U and V, but the first thing to note is that even though this is the case, it can be still worse for other banks in the system. So if we have this node W here, then before the swap, whichever node loses its funds, we see that W still receives a payment of 2, so assets of 2 from this network. On the other hand, after swapping, while this is better for U and V, we now have the fact that if this source node falls out, then W now only gets a payment of 1. So it's actually more dependent on this source node. And actually one can even create an example where such a positive swap is worse for one of the debtors of the swap contracts. For this, you need a cyclic network topology, but it's still not a very complex example. But this suggests that maybe the debtors should still have a say in who they are paying this money to, because it might really concern them. So a second perspective to look at this Vert set shocks is from a computational perspective. So it's not hard to show actually by reduction that finding the worst shock of K banks is actually an NP-hard problem. So we have this interesting case here that the number of potential swaps between any two banks or even in the whole network is polynomial, but we still cannot find positive swaps efficiently, because even if we have a given swap, then we will not be able to evaluate whether this is positive or not in polynomial time. And of course, there's some examples where this is easier in practice. For example, if we consider a small K, so we only consider shocks up to a small constant size, then there's only n-choose k possibilities how this can hit the network, which is polynomial for a constant k. And another example is tree networks, where essentially by going topologically, a dynamic programming algorithm can compute the worst shock for every node. And this deserves a side note because so far we have always motivated our positive shocks by, the depth swapping operation by removing multiple dependencies in the network, which is not possible in trees. But it turns out that even in trees, it's possible to have a positive swap. So essentially, even without multiple dependencies, it's possible that swapping creates a tree of better shape, which is therefore more resilient to shocks of a specific size. Okay, so there are still some simple cases for which the problem can be evaluated in polynomial time. And then the third perspective we're going to look at is looking at the whole depth swapping operation as a way for the nodes to improve their situation in the network. And in that sense, one can see that this operation can easily get stuck in local minima. So for example, you can create a situation where U and V have no pair of contracts which they can swap to obtain a positive swap in the network or even a semi-positive swap. But instead, if U and V decided to swap multiple contracts together in one transaction, then that creates a better situation. So there's no positive swap, but there is a positive swapping of multiple contracts. And also, one can do this with multiple nodes, where node to nodes can swap a pair of contracts, but instead, if they shift the contracts around, then we get a better situation. So there's, of course, many ways to improve this whole area and come up with more results. One possibility is to extend the model with default costs when nodes lose some amount of money when they go into default, which makes positive swap possible in all of these cases. And also, it's of course more interesting if nodes have a different expectation or different shock model that they are working with. So yeah, with that, I thank you for your attention and I'm happy to answer any questions.